I'm a 28-year-old guy, currently working as a volunteer at a pet rescue shelter. I've been working like this for about 2 years. I love this job. This story happened about a year ago. It all began when a new girl started working with the shelter. I'll call her Gracie. Gracie was 21 years old and incredibly shy, or at least it seemed that way at first. During her first few weeks, she would only talk in one-word sentences, no matter what she was asked about. No matter how often the rest of us tried to get her involved in social stuff, she would decline. A few weeks in, she started making comments like, "I just don't like people," and "I just prefer to be left alone." People obliged and left her alone. When she had been working at the shelter for about 1.5 months, she started following around a few guys like a lost puppy, drooling when she thought no one was watching her. I was one of those guys. Her behavior was outright creepy, as she was still not talking very much, just following people around, staring at them like a dog in heat. At one point, I was straight with her, and I told her I found her behavior very creepy. I told her she should be careful because some people might interpret her behavior as sexual harassment. She just looked away. Shit went down a few weeks later when I managed to stumble upon Gracie's Tumblr. I found it because she had posted a picture of herself standing with one of the pups from the shelter. She had added a lot of hashtags about her local shelter, apparently in an attempt to spread awareness. Out of curiosity, I visited the page, and boy, it was just a Pandora's box of creepiness. Basically, Gracie's Tumblr could be split into 3 parts. One part was pictures of random people, most of which were people at work, and all of which were obviously snapped without consent of the person. All of the pictures had stories attached about how the person in the picture was bad. Most of these stories were about how the person had been bullying Gracie or making sexist or homophobic comments and acting generally shitty. All of these kinds of stories ended with Gracie stepping in and telling the person to check their privilege, as if the stories weren't unbelievable enough on their own. The next part of her Tumblr was pictures of guys she thought were hot, both real and fictional. In between the pictures were stories about how these people were mixed up in various relationships. Gracie had even made up stories about these 2 guys at work being together, and she had countless pictures of them together, doing stuff like talking or caring for an animal, with notions of, "See, they're totally in love, gays are so cute." Both of these guys were in healthy relationships with women at the time. The last part was Gracie either reblogging or submitting texts about social justice, especially from the extremist parts of Tumblr. I found a post talking about how a guy at work had told her off just because she had been looking in his direction. The conclusion to this post was, "I don't see what his problem is anyway, guys think about sex all the time. It's not like it's a violation when guys actually want sex. They can't get sexually harassed because they would never actually object to sex." The post had been reblogged with various comments of, "Dumb cis scum." At first I wasn't sure what to do about all of this. I knew something definitely had to be done, but I didn't know what. In the end, I went to my boss and we had a talk. She told me this was probably just Gracie living in a fantasy on the net, but acknowledged that it did have to stop. The 3 of us sat down and talked, and Gracie was utterly humiliated that someone had found her Tumblr. She didn't outright apologize, but she did seem to accept that it had to stop and understood that what she was doing was borderline illegal. The next few weeks, Gracie became a shadow creeping around the shelter, somehow even more antisocial than she had been before. My boss only kept her around because she was always free to work at whatever odd hours were needed. Her Tumblr seemingly got deleted, but I had a creeping feeling that this wasn't the end of it. About 2 weeks later, I was checking out the accounts that had been friends with Gracie's account. Mainly, I wanted to find out how far Gracie's lies and stories had spread. Mostly it was just her social justice stuff and the gay stories about the guys at work people had been reblogging. Through all of this, I found out Gracie had a new Tumblr, one which was even creepier than the old one. The new Tumblr didn't have lots of posts, not at all like the first one, but those it did have were even worse than her old ones used to be. One of the first posts was an explanation of how she had been forced to shut down her old Tumblr. Some lies about how it was because she was supporting the LGBT community and her boss was thinking ill of that. The next couple posts were either updates on the gay couple and stories about them, or posts about this shitty dude at work. What made these posts really terrifying was that she made threats about killing me. She even wrote long paragraphs about how she would strangle me, poison me, or stab me, and how great it would feel to kill off a cis scum such as I. What really made my heart jump was when I found a picture of my house. A few similar posts had been made about some of our coworkers, but apparently it was mainly me she held a grudge towards. I went to my boss again, this time telling her I would get the police involved too because this sort of behavior was way too far. Gracie was called in again and got an earful, but during the entire talk, it became obvious that Gracie had no idea how wrong her behavior really was. She told us it was just stuff inside her head, that she would never actually do it, but when asked why she had been uploading pictures of my home, why she had been stalking people and kept snapping pictures without consent, she just made up some bullshit about how it wasn't us in any of those pictures. I finally blew my fuse and told Gracie I would talk to the police, because I sure as hell wasn't going to stand by as some creep was following me around with a camera. The police got involved, and as part of the case, they confiscated Gracie's phone. Apparently, this led to another case of drug possession, and Gracie was later taken to jail. I don't know what happened to her then, but I'm hoping she's in a place where she can no longer upload bullshit like that on her blog. I work at a retail store. I go into work a morning shift that starts before the store opens to perform inventory counts, and generally there's just 2 people there in the whole building before 8 a.m. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I lived with 2 roommates, Aaron and Charles. Aaron had his own room, and my girlfriend and I shared a room, while Charles crashed on the couch and contributed about $150 towards rent and bills a month. Everything seemed fine, but a time came when a coworker of ours offered Charles his own room over at the house he was renting. Charles jumped at the offer because it was only another $100 a month and he would have his own bedroom and bathroom. Everything with all that seemed great because even though one of my best friends was moving out, he was only moving about 2 blocks away and we were still able to hang out all the time. Things stayed about the same like this for a few months. Charles and I hung out all the time, either going over to his place or coming back after work to mine. It wasn't until early December, roughly 4 months after he moved out, that things started to get odd. CJ, Charles' new roommate, began to get really weird. He became secretive, and we all considered him to be really paranoid. The house that Charles moved into was laid out in a sideways Y. On the left side of the house was the garage, kitchen and dining room, living room, and a bathroom. To the right was the staircase, which went up half a level and down half a level. Upstairs was a bedroom, bathroom, spare room, and a storage closet. Downstairs was a family room or game room, and another bathroom and bedroom. Charles lived in the upstairs bedroom. Someone else was temporarily staying in the spare room, and CJ was in the bedroom downstairs. Around the back of the house was a basement or storage room that looked like a door was installed to give access to the inside of the house as an afterthought. The main entrance to the room was on the outside, and CJ had the door chained shut and padlocked. He had also laid out very crinkly tarps and covered them in dead leaves. The way the extra door had been added to the room, the only other entrance or exit to it led to the bedroom CJ had decided to take. Charles kept insisting that CJ was up to bizarre things, but I kept brushing it off. He was known to do a lot of drinking and almost no sleeping, so I attributed it to those two things and thought nothing of it. It wasn't until a few weeks into December that I started noticing that when I came back home after spending time at that house, my eyes felt itchy and stung a little bit. If I stayed over there for too long, I had a tightness in my chest that would develop and I would have difficulties breathing. At the time, the person staying in the upstairs spare room brought their cat with them, and I figured it was just allergies, despite the fact that my girlfriend and I have 2 cats ourselves. I noticed that if I go into someone else's house and they have cats, sometimes my allergies will flare up. It's the same thing that happens when I'm cleaning at home and dust and cat hair are all over. Near the end of December, CJ had gotten a letter in the mail from the landlord of the house saying that they had 60 days to leave as it was going up for sale. The older lady that they were renting the house from had encountered some health problems and was going to move a few states away to be closer to her family. It was about that time that CJ started to get really weird, and I started noticing it. Like I mentioned before, I work at a retail store and go in early, and perform inventory counts on a lot of the high-dollar items we carry. It's a tedious job, sure, but it was a full-time job and I got benefits, weekends off, and my day was done at 2 p.m. CJ was generally the opening manager on duty who would go in with me at 6 to open up. My normal routine before work consisted of driving to the grocery store across the street from where I worked and getting a coffee at about 5. I would drink my coffee and read the news on my tablet or phone using the Wi-Fi in my car for about half an hour to 45 minutes. After that, I would head across the intersection to work and sit and wait for the opening manager to arrive. Sometimes they would get there early, so that's why I tried to show up about 15 to 20 minutes early every day. Around the time that CJ got the letter, I started noticing that when I would go to get my morning coffee, he would be parked further down in the parking lot in front of the 24-hour drugstore. The first few days, I thought nothing of it. Next door to the drugstore was a small bakery that offered free Wi-Fi as well, and would open up at 5. But I started to notice that when I went to go and park in my work's parking lot, he would move to a different parking lot and sit there watching me. Around the time we would have to go in, he would drive with the lights off out of the parking lot and out of view, then pull into our parking lot like nothing had happened. He would always make up some excuse like, "Oh, hey, sorry, I was running late this morning." The weekend after this all started happening, Charles let me know that some weird stuff was going on at his house. I went over and we hung out in the driveway smoking cigarettes, and he filled me in on what was going on. He didn't want to go inside because CJ was acting really odd. Whenever anyone upstairs would leave their rooms, CJ would be at the bottom of the stairs waiting to see what they were doing. Several times a night, always right after midnight, a car of people Charles didn't know would arrive, and CJ would lead them around the back of the house and they went into the locked room. They would be there for more than half an hour, and then the people would leave. I stayed the night over at the house. Charles and I walked to the bottle shop between our houses and picked up some beers and more smokes. We were gone for maybe 15 minutes, and in that time, CJ had locked the door on us. Since we were only going to be gone for a short time, Charles didn't bring his keys, and we ended up having to pound on the door until CJ came around and peeked through the kitchen blinds to see who it was. It took him about 5 minutes to walk the 20 feet to the front door and let us in. We were able to see him clearly in the living room, pacing around before he let us back in. The following day, after CJ had left for work, Charles and I went into the garage to investigate what Charles had found a few days prior. On a shelf in the corner of the garage, what was appeared to be at least half of the ingredients for making meth. Along the far wall in the garage were 10-gallon plastic paint buckets full of mysterious, murky-looking chemicals. They could have been anything, but they had a very foul smell that was very similar to what the smell from CJ's room was. There were 2 48 packs of heat, which, where I'm at, is only available to auto shops and not to a normal customer. Buried underneath a bunch of clutter was a box full of garbage. The clutter around that specific area looked like it was recently disturbed, and we found a wad of coffee filters that were stained red and smelled like burnt matches. After investigating the garage, we looked in CJ's room and found a lot of empty cold medicine bottles. CJ, it seemed, was buying a lot of cold medication, and when I say a lot, I mean 4 to 8 boxes a day. He, from what Charles could gather, would go to at least 3 grocery stores and drugstores a day and purchase cold medicine. He had a system where he would hit up the same 2 stores every day and alternate the third. The first 2 never carded for the medication, but the others would. I helped Charles move back into my apartment that same day. Charles left an envelope with the last bit of rent and bills he owed for the following 2 months, plus a little extra for his dump and run. We scrubbed and scoured his room to make sure everything looked fine so there wouldn't be any complaints from CJ. This was when things got really scary. This was when we started noticing the white vans. We first noticed we were getting followed by white vans when we saw them with businesses printed on the side that didn't exist, circling our block. We would be outside smoking when we would see the vans go by. One would pass by about 5 minutes later, and again after that. This would go on for quite a while. One day, we left the apartment and noticed a white van near the bottle shop, parked in the small parking lot. As we went down the road, we saw another one pull down a side road and sit near the bottom of the hill. Near the on-ramp for the highway was a small park, and in the parking lot was another white van. This was also the same time that CJ would start circling our block for hours. When he wasn't at work, CJ had begun to stalk my girlfriend, Erin, Charles, and me. Some days we would come home from the store and there would be red paint smeared on our door, and we would see CJ's blue car turn the corner and disappear. Some nights we would go outside for a cigarette and find CJ's car sitting across the street. We would find him randomly in town when we would go shopping, or other times we would head over to one of our buddies' houses in the middle of the boonies, and he would find us and drive up and down the road all night. We ended up calling the cops a few times, but he was always gone by the time they showed up. We called and had the cops do a welfare check on him because he was getting more and more agitated at work. His eyes were puffy and he always had dark circles. This was about the time that CJ got really mad at Charles. CJ was demanding that because Charles left early, even though he paid for his last bit of rent and bills, he owed even more money to him for various expenses. When Charles refused to pay them, CJ began threatening him. He let slip the fact that he owned an unlicensed firearm among his large collection of other firearms. He would then later mention how he was planning to break Charles's legs. This went on for 2 weeks. Everywhere we went, CJ would be there. Anytime Charles or I would leave the apartment, CJ would follow us. He would go into my girlfriend's work and try to bully her into getting free food. On several occasions, we found evidence of forced entry on Charles's car, but nothing would be missing. However, his glove box and center console were rooted through. Aaron thought we were all full of shit until the day Charles was giving him a ride home, and CJ attempted to run them off the road. Charles, Aaron, and I all ended up filing notices with management at work and ended up getting CJ fired. We're pretty sure he knew exactly who placed the complaints, despite about 4 or 5 other people who placed them as well. We were followed for weeks after that. He would come home and find scratches and various things smeared on our door. By the time he had to leave the house he was renting, he was gone and we didn't see him anymore. He ended up moving to a different state for a few years. Recently, though, he moved back into town. Luckily, we don't have the same apartment. CJ works at a gas station not too far from where we live, maybe a 10-minute walk, and one morning I stopped in on my way to work to get a pack of smokes. I didn't know he worked there at the time, and when he saw me, I felt obligated not to turn around and leave. I got my cigarettes and he carded me despite knowing how old I am, and studied my ID for a rather long time. My guess was he was trying to see where I was living now. Luckily, I hadn't updated my license with my new address since moving. This was a few months ago. Luckily, he hasn't found any of our new apartments. When I was around 24 years old, I moved to LA and took a job as an ESL teacher at a private school for international students. I had very little experience teaching, so one of the other instructors, Heather, took me under her wing. I thought Heather was pretty cool. She was in her early 30s, had traveled the world, had been a professional ski instructor in Colorado, and seemed like a fairly put-together individual. We went to book fairs, shopping, had lunch on a regular basis, and nothing ever seemed off or unusual about her. One night around 10 p.m., I got a frantic call from Heather. She seemed genuinely panicked and told me someone was trying to hurt her. She was crying so hard I couldn't make out most of what she was saying. She said she was driving to my house and she would stay on her portable phone until it lost signal. This was before cell phones were common. About 20 minutes later, she shows up at my door, drunk off her ass, still clutching the phone. She tells me her mother's a satanic witch and is trying to cast a spell on her to kill her, and that she needs to stay somewhere safe. After spending an hour trying to calm her down, she asked if I can use my phone. I told her sure, and she proceeded to call her ex-boyfriend long distance from my house 12 times to leave creepy Linda Blair growlings and unintelligible animal noises on his answering machine. By then, I was desperate to get rid of her and more than a little afraid. I didn't own a car, so I offered to drive her home in her car, and she said she would give me cash to take a cab home. She lived about 7 miles away, so it didn't take long to get her there. She begged me to come up to her apartment to make sure it was safe. I got her into her apartment and things got ugly quickly. I told her, well, it looked safe to me, I'd best be on my way. She suddenly turned around with the most evil and predatory look on her face, pointed a can of what looked to be fucking bear mace at me and said, "You aren't going anywhere." This was some seriously creepy serial killer behavior. I cooperated with her as best as I could, participating in a weird ritual she concocted to protect her from her mother's spell. I watched her roll her eyes, contort her body, make gurgling noises, speak in tongues, and every once in a while she would lunge at me and hiss like a lizard. The entire time, she had the can of mace in one hand and was waving around a butcher knife in the other. She kept stabbing at imaginary demons with the knife and making hissing noises. It was unreal. When she seemed to calm down a bit, she made me sit on her couch and debate the difference between Stendhal's view of the French aristocracy versus Sade's. I shit you not. She was mostly incoherent, and I haven't read Stendhal, so the conversation was sort of like the scene in The Vampire's Kiss, where Nicolas Cage is talking to his imaginary girlfriend on the street. I tried to act normal, as if we were having a typical conversation, and I didn't have a ginormous can of mace pointed at me. Every once in a while, I would casually mention that I should probably head out, and she would begin getting agitated again. Once she even barked at me like a dog until I sat back down. By this point, I was more tired and angry than afraid, but her behavior was so unpredictable I couldn't be sure what she was capable of. She mentioned having a gun and asked me if I wanted to see it, and I thankfully managed to distract her by offering to make her another drink. This lasted several hours. She always had either the knife or the mace in her hand, usually both. At one point, she even had me get out her family albums for us to look at. She continued to drink more, and each time she had to pee, she left the door to the bathroom open so she could see me, since the bathroom was across from the front door. I didn't want to risk it. Finally, she got so drunk that she forgot to leave the door open, and I made my escape. I ran down the steps of her apartment building and out to the streets of Hollywood at 3:30 a.m. I had only been living there a few months. I had no idea where I was. I had no money. I didn't know where an ATM was, and I didn't have anyone I could call for help. I started walking, and a cab pulled over and asked me if I needed a ride. I tried to explain the situation to the driver. He luckily took pity on me and drove me home for free. The following Monday at work, she acted like nothing had happened. She didn't even seem to remember calling me that night. I said nothing, avoided her like the plague, and eventually left that job about 2 weeks later for a better paying one.